Good afternoon, everyone. If I can have your attention, please, for a moment. Excuse me. So welcome, everybody, to our event today. Thanks so much for coming. It's wonderful to see such a large crowd for an important topic. Happy Tuesday to each of you as well. So we've got a lot to discuss, obviously, and we're going to move right along. So my name is Dickson from the Columbia World Affairs Council Executive Director, and I'm thrilled to be partnering with the Walker Institute of International and Area Studies at the University of South Carolina for yet another wonderful Palmetto forum. Please allow me to introduce the director of the Walker Institute, Dr. Joshua Grace.
Thanks, Dickson, and thanks to all of you for coming out, taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for lunch today. As Dickson said, I'm Dr. Josh Grace. I am the interim director of the Walker Institute and an associate professor in the Department of History. Just a couple of things before I introduce our distinguished panel of guests. The first is that this is the first in a series of two events. The second event will take place on March 16th around likely the exact same title. This will take place, for those of you who want to pull out your phones and put this on your calendar. This is March 16th, a Wednesday, 3 to 4:30. It will be held in the Halling Library Programs Room, which is the big room in the back of the Thomas Cooper Library. For those of you who heard about this event through the Columbia World Affairs Council or through the Walker Institute, Palmetto Club, or Forum listserv, that announcement will go out, and you'll know about that as well. We'd love to see you on campus instead of just seeing you all here. That would be lovely. The second is for those of you who were here in December, we announced a new initiative. The Walker Institute is home to two majors, the Global Studies major and the Cyber Intelligence major. For both of those majors, study abroad is integral to students' experiences and their ability to be trained in what they'll go on to do. So the Walker Institute has started soliciting contributions for a study abroad fund. It will be there. If you do your Eventbrite, it's the button under that. If you have any other questions about it, either get in touch with me or Jody Salter. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our three panelists and our moderator. I'm going to start from your right with Colonel Robert Peters, who this is his first Palmetto forum. He enlisted in the Army as a Russian linguist in 1991 and ultimately served overseas for 14 years, including 4 of those in the former Soviet Union. He served a tour in Afghanistan in 2003 before working in the Eurasian Foreign Area Office, and that included an interesting task as acting as the translator on the Moscow-Washington hotline in the Pentagon. He has been at Shaw Air Force Base more recently, where he served as the Security Cooperation Division Chief for the U.S. Army Central Command, and that includes 8 months as the Russian Deconfliction Cell Chief. He has a Master's of International Public Policy from George Washington University. It's also a pleasure to welcome Mr. Stephen Austermiller. Mr. Austermiller is the Deputy Executive Director of the Rule of Law Collaborative, which for those of you who are on campus is more commonly known as ROLC. He manages ROLC's international programs in Ukraine, Moldova, Sri Lanka, and Armenia. His experience includes working for U.S. government-supported rule of law programs in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and he has published extensively on conflict mediation, including on Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia, and Cambodia. Mr. Austermiller received his JD and a BA in Political Science and Economics from Northwestern University. Next, we have someone who is certainly not a stranger to the Walker Institute or to the Palmetto Forum, Professor Gordon Smith. Professor Smith is a distinguished professor emeritus of political science. Professor Gordon has held a number of positions at UofSC. These include Associate Dean of Liberal Arts, Interim Dean of Liberal Arts, Associate Dean of the Graduate School, Director of the Walker Institute of International and Area Studies, including his work shaping the Palmetto Forum into what it is today. He's also founding director of the Rule of Law Collaborative. His research interests include legal and political reform in the former USSR and democratic transitions. He's published books that include State Building in Russia, The Yeltsin Legacy and the Challenges of the Future, as well as reforming the Russian legal system. Finally, it's a pleasure to welcome Dean and Professor of Law Joel Samuels, who will serve as our moderator. Dean Samuels currently is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. He is also the Executive Director of the Rule of Law Collaborative. He previously served as Interim Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies. Dean Samuels earned his JD at the University of Michigan, where he also earned a master's degree in Russian and East European Studies. Dean Samuels' work includes publications on Russian federalism, and I was scouring each of our panelists' publications this morning. I'm an African historian, so this is new to me as well. And in working through Dean Samuels, some of his work, I think part of it provided a good transition, at least for me, someone on the outside looking in, into where we might be now and where some of the things this panel might talk about. In his 2016 chapter, Dancing the Rumba, Federalism Reform in Russia under Putin and Medvedev, Dean Samuels compares Russian federalism to a dance, the rumba, and he writes, "No single issue defines Russia, past, present, or future, more than the question of center-periphery relations," which seemed, in a different way than Dean Samuels goes on in the chapter, seemed to be playing out before our very eyes. With that, I will end with an apology. I get to go teach a senior seminar in history, get to be with a bunch of lovely UofSC students, so I have to apologize for walking out early. But with that, please help me welcome our guests to the Palmetto Forum.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Dickson. I'm going to stand. I think our panelists are all going to stay seated. I'm sort of in a corner. I just want to quickly make a couple of opening remarks. I want to begin by thanking our partners at the World Affairs Council and Dickson Monk, and I want to thank Jody Salter and Josh Grace for working to help put this event together. This is part of a renewed effort to have, as you see from the presence of a broad group at the Palmetto Forum, to have more engagement from the university, both faculty and students in the Palmetto Forums, and that is what we hope many of you will be able to come for the second stage of this project, talk about Ukraine. When this event was scheduled, brilliant as Dickson, Jody, and Josh are, they did not plan that Putin would invade Ukraine the night before, I can assure you. And even a week ago, as Russian troops mounted on the border, there were real questions about whether there would in fact be an invasion. There were real questions when you look at the size of the Russian army and the amount of military forces relative to the Russian army. There were legitimate arguments that this was just an effort by Putin to rattle sabers, to see how the West would react. As I like to say, sadly, I think Vladimir Putin wins coming and going here. In other words, I think, I have no idea how the other panels will react to what I'm going to say, but because he is seeing in real time how the West is reacting to aggression. He's seeing how the Germans will react. He's seeing how the alliances across Europe respond to acts of aggression. Beyond the scope for today, but let me add, I think the biggest winners in all of this are the Chinese government leaders. Because China also is seeing the same thing, and they have a number of interests, whether it relates to Taiwan specifically or the South China Sea more broadly. And I think what we're seeing is the amount of will there is or is not to defend against attacks against sovereignty and acts of aggression in the face of lack of provocation. I have a strange relationship with this panel, or most of this panel, because as you may have heard in Josh's introduction, 3 of the 4 members of this panel either are or were affiliated with something called the Rule of Law Collaborative at the University of South Carolina. This center, which has grown, which is really the brainchild of Gordon Smith, has grown to be one of the nation's leading centers on the rule of law, both at home and abroad. Steve, I know, will talk about some of the work in Ukraine, or at least some thoughts on the situation in light of his time in Ukraine through our work. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is really an attack on the rule of law. It is, of course, a physical attack, but it's also an attack on the basic tenets that hold society together, that hold states accountable for their actions. Just before this talk began, someone said, are there really no checks and balances in Russia? Can Putin really just do whatever he wants? There are no checks and balances in Russia. Putin sat in a room yesterday with what was called the Security Council. It was, if you saw the pictures of it or the videos of it, it was a cavernous room. They were not social distancing, I didn't think. They were all 6 feet from each other, but they were about 46 feet from Putin, who was at the head table. So it wasn't like this was a roundtable discussion. This was very much an individual leader making a decision that has tremendous other value, but at the end of the day has important patriotic, symbolic value for Russia, for Russians. I think our panelists will speak to various aspects of the threats that I've maybe opened the door to. Gordon will speak first, and then Steve, and then Bob, and then each one of them will speak for 7 to 10 minutes. We want to leave time for your questions today as well. So I'm thrilled to be able to, my only job, by the way, I'm a relatively recently named dean, and I think the reason they asked me to be moderator is my only job is to keep time. And so they assume that somehow this is a test, the provost is here, so this is a test of whether I can do my job and keep my colleagues in line on time. But they'll each share some opening thoughts and then hope to have a rich discussion today. Thank you all for being here. Gordon?
Thank you, Jordan. And welcome to everybody from the attendance Palmetto Forum. I'm glad to see it flourishing like this. I'm going to be very general because we have had so many facts cascading into our minds these days that it's hard to keep them all in place. So I'm going to open with some kind of general or even theoretical observations, and then maybe move on to something that's a bit more provocative, and that might spawn some questions. But in international relations, we frequently talk about nations being motivated by, I categorize it as two things. One is power, the ability to use brute force when necessary, or election support to get what you want. And then there is principle. And I think that in this conflict that we're seeing, we both sides, I will say, have vacillated at times between power plays and plays based upon principle. Principles could be democratic elections, territorial, legitimacy of territorial occupation and that sort of thing. So with that kind of as a background, let me just say that it's been pretty consistent out of Russia under Putin in terms of what their goals and ambitions and their sensitivities are. Russia's been engaged in a strategy of denial in Eastern Europe, denial of American or NATO power as best they can make that happen. And so there's been a very consistent strategy of denial to expansion of NATO. That's been a consistent line. We're hearing it now today too. The right line is Putin keeps saying this, and he means it, that Russia has good reason to be fearful of having NATO troops stationed in Ukraine. And so that really has been very constant, and it hasn't changed. On our side, we have tended to talk more about principle, about elections, that the Ukrainian people have a right to govern themselves and choose their own leaders and to have autonomy over their own territory. And so we have been making a principle argument, whereas Putin's been making a security argument. And, sometimes that gets flip-flopped. I mean, if we think that Russia doesn't have the right to feel threatened by the potential of NATO troops in Ukraine, let me remind you about the Cuban Missile Crisis and our sensitivities to Russian missiles potentially going into Cuba. And you could have flipped those things. The Soviet Union could have said, Cuba would like to have these or allow these in, and we would like them there. And our side said, we perceive a threat from that. So, as far as the West is concerned, I go back to around the period of 2004, 2006, culminating in 2008, where the Bush administration, led mostly by Vice President Cheney, but also with Condoleezza Rice and President Bush himself and Donald Rumsfeld, were pushing hard. They were doing a full court press to get Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. And there was very little sensitivity, or at least public acknowledgement of sensitivity of how this is going to play in Moscow. That this would be a real threat to the core security of Russia as a nation. So in many ways, they're kind of talking past one another. I know in that period, 2004 to 2008, Vice President Cheney was making multiple visits to both Ukraine and Georgia, making promises to their governments about NATO, acceding to NATO membership. And it was, especially as it got closer to the 2008 election, the temperature on that, the immediacy of that picked up. Again, I guess I'm questioning how is that going to play in Moscow? We should have known that what a threat that would be perceived as. Now, just a few words about NATO, and then I'll pass the microphone on. During that same period, starting around 2004 to 2008, there was active discussion within NATO on NATO enlargement, mostly at the initiative of the United States. And they developed something called the Membership Action Plan for member states that are trying to get in. I'm going to say this following things I'm going to say, I haven't been reading in the press or hearing on the news media. At the Riga NATO Summit in 2006, NATO affirmed the principle of Georgia and Ukrainian progress toward the MAP, the Membership Action Plan, developing the Membership Action Plan for getting into NATO. There was very little discussion about how is this going to play in Moscow? What kind of threat, what kind of kickback are we going to get from that? Then 2 years later in 2008 at the Bucharest meetings of NATO, they actually invited both Ukraine and Georgia to develop a membership action plan. And without stressing it too much, the membership action plans go back to 1999 in NATO, and they state specifically that aspirants to join NATO are expected to settle any disputes by peaceful means, and even then, Germany, France, Italy, Hungary, and the Benelux nations said, this is going too fast, too far. We're going to get some kickback from this, and so we need to beware. Nevertheless, in August 2008, again, the United States is pushing hard to get an actual action plan for both Georgia and Ukraine. And violence starts to break out in the two regions that we now know in Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And then later we see the breakout in Luhansk and Donetsk in Ukraine. I went back to look at the NATO documents, and I'm just going to read one element of an update of the Membership Action Plan parameters from November 1988. It states, states which have ethnic disputes or external territorial disputes, including irredentist claims or internal jurisdictional disputes, must settle those disputes by peaceful means in accordance with the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, determining whether to invite a state into the alliance. They have since made it very explicit because there's ongoing fighting in Ukraine and Georgia, those states under NATO guidelines would not be eligible to join NATO. And so what strikes me as odd is that by pursuing this path so aggressively, it has in essence created a perverse incentive for Putin to stir up trouble and invade those countries so that they would have border disputes, they would have ethnic disputes within those countries, therefore presumably making them ineligible for joining NATO. And so now when Putin is saying having NATO on our borders is a strategic threat to our country, and I think from their perspective it looks like there's been some changing horses in midstream. I don't know what the metaphor is, but it has led to where we are today. Theoretically, given what's gone on in the last 24 hours, Ukraine should, should have no claim to future NATO membership, the way I read it from NATO's documents. So hopefully that'll spark some controversy here.
Thank you, Gordon. As Joel mentioned, at the Rule of Law Collaborative here at the university, we have ongoing Ukraine programs for the last 3 or 4 years. We've been going over there to Kyiv and Kharkiv to work with professionals on this Rule of Law certificate program we're really excited about. I won't go into the details. Other than to say that my last international trip was in mid-March of 2020. And I remember it was about a day before I was supposed to leave. My wife said, "Are you sure you want to go? There's this virus out there." And I thought, how bad can it be? And it wasn't the last time that listening to my wife was the right call. But we really, really do hope to continue the programming. It's not dead yet. It's just sort of in advance, and we'll see what happens. I want to key off of a couple of things that Gordon mentioned, which is about the NATO expansion. And as a thought experiment, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, is an interesting example. And I say this just as a thought experiment because I teach negotiation at the law school here. And one of the things I always try to tell people is to put yourself in the shoes of your adversary. Understand what your adversary is thinking and why. And so just for a moment, try to put yourselves in the shoes of the ordinary Russian and how they might look at the last 30 years, the sweep of history that we view as the triumph of democracy, free markets, freedom, rule of law, etc. And the average Russian just doesn't see it that way. Now, I'm painting in broad brushes because you can always find, it's a huge country, 150 million people, but the average Russian actually supports what's happening. Now, of course, we can't get, all of the public opinion polls, the latest scientific data, but generally speaking, Putin's propaganda campaign over the last few months and few years was already on fertile ground. He didn't have to convince people that he wanted to take over Ukraine. This was already a strong sense of loss and grievance amongst the Russians. If you ask yourselves, flip history, starting in 1990, if the US, the two superpowers, had gone the opposite way and Western Europe went communist and joined the Warsaw Pact, and then a few US states left and joined the Warsaw Pact, how would we be feeling today with all of our former allies and some of our former states joining with the Soviet Union, bringing military advisors in and so on? We would have a sense of loss and we would have a grievance. So it's important to understand that. This does not in any way justify what Putin is doing. I'm not saying that at all. There's no international law basis for what he's doing. But it's important to at least understand their mindset. Gordon also mentioned the 2008, the Bucharest Summit, which was when the NATO Secretary General said definitively, Ukraine and Georgia will someday join. And that was a bit of a red line in Moscow, which I think set us on the path that we're here today. In Georgia, I spent 4 years working on a U.S. government rule of law program in Georgia. Soon after that, what happened in Georgia was it took about 4 months before the Russians had invaded. They had breakaway. Actually, we've got some slides here, right? So they had some breakaway provinces here in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and it was a very similar kind of thing that was happening in Ukraine. Separatists declaring independence, Russian agreeing to support the independence, then Russian troops, finally Russian invasion. Now this was tipped off by Saakashvili, who was very pro-American, but in August of 2008, the Russians invaded. It took 5 days, so if you were like on vacation in August, you missed it. It happened quickly, but the Russians didn't mess around. They invaded land, air, sea, cyber, propaganda, everything. They went all in, and they weren't messing around. And this gives you an example of how they view NATO expansion. And Ukraine is Georgia times 10, right? Because it's 10 times the population. It's in the heartland of the former Soviet Union and so on. Oh, one funny story I'll mention about Georgia. When I was there, so the Russians had put a fence. They put a fence where South Ossetia, this province right here, there was never a border because this was part of Georgia. And along the southern border, they put up a fence to sort of demarcate the Russian-controlled parts of South Ossetia. And in the middle of the night, they started moving that fence south. We'd wake up, and they would say, well, there's a new farm that's been like subsumed within the Russian side. And it was absolutely bonkers, crazy. You'd say, well, how could you do that? They just dug it up and put cement down, and there it was. And the Georgian government was absolutely at a loss. They couldn't just go to war with Russia over this. And this happened over and over and over again. Why? Why did the Russians do this? There's a pipeline, a very important pipeline, oil and gas from Azerbaijan over here in the east, that goes through Georgia on the way to Turkey and then to the rest of Europe. And the Russians wanted to make sure that that fence went far enough south so that it just went over that pipeline. Now, did they do anything about it? No, it's all about leverage. Now that fence sits in one small part right on top of that pipeline. So, why is Georgia important? Georgia's important because, first of all, it shows how serious Russia takes NATO expansion on its borders. Second, I believe it shows that Russia's MO is these breakaway republics. It's all about the breakaway republics. And third, I think it shows that the Russians are willing to go all in. I'm not predicting that we're about to see a full-on invasion. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. But they are absolutely prepared to do it if Putin wants to. And the last thing I want to just say, and then I'll hand over the mic, is, I was just this morning, I'm working with a Ukrainian colleague in Kharkiv who is going to be coming here for a Fulbright scholarship next year. Kharkiv, by the way, is the second city right there in the east. They're about 15 miles from the border. Kharkiv is actually a happy story. If you recall when the Donbass breakaway war started, Kharkiv was actually the third of the three cities that they had targeted: Donetsk, Luhansk, and then Kharkiv. It's a Russian-speaking city. It's historically considered very Russian by many, and it was a concern. But the Ukrainian government was smart. They talked about planes landing in the square. There were buildings, municipal buildings taken over. But the Ukrainians were smart. They didn't panic. They didn't bring in the troops. They were actually, they talked to people, they formed local collectives, and somehow Kharkiv stayed in Ukraine and wasn't lost. Today, everybody, my colleague tells me, everybody today in Kharkiv who was kind of on the fence at the time, do we really want to be part of Ukraine versus Russia? Well, we speak Russian, maybe we should be part of Russia. Not anymore. Nobody in Kharkiv, I shouldn't say nobody, most people in Kharkiv do not want what happened in Donetsk to happen in Kharkiv. And that, I think, is a cause, it gives cause for a little bit of optimism, because Putin and the Russian population might support this. But even in the heartland of eastern Ukraine, this is not popular, and they will not be happy. They will fight this. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate those comments. What I may do is, for my portion, talk a little bit more about Ukraine specifically and briefly about my experience there. And then I'll pose a question at the end for everyone, and we can go on to the conversation. First of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be here my first time here. It's a really nice establishment, and it's good to see all the interest in the current events that are going on right now. I'm not here to talk about me, but I just want to make clear I'm on the path to retirement. Knock on the wood. Having worked for Arson, I should enter retirement on 1 April, but my own experiences today are my own personal observations, and I don't really speak for any European command who I worked for when I was overseas, or my current organization, still U.S. Army Central Command. where we handle the Middle East portfolio, which is another whole interesting area of Russian involvement. I was the security cooperation chief in Ukraine from 2017 to 2019. So when we left Ukraine, we came right here to Columbia for my last job at RSN. I thought Columbia would be a nice place to live. Originally from Virginia, but South Carolina sounded rather enticing. It seemed like a nice place to go, and I think we made a good decision. But just really briefly, so we were responsible for all of the security assistance and security cooperation for the United States with Ukraine. And I was really honored to have the job. I kind of found out, hey, you're going to Ukraine next when I was in Germany. I was like, okay, all right, it sounds good. I've been there before. The first time I went was in 2006. And so I got to work with the people in the office, great local hires, a great team. A lot of them were still there when I came back. I got to go back in 2014 because we didn't have a chief, we had a gap. And Office of the Secretary of Defense said, hey, we'd like to get somebody in there. And I got lucky to be offered to go. I went for about 6 weeks. And the Maidan area, which those of y'all know is that central area right in downtown, was still torn up. There were pavers missing from where the protesters had been throwing pavers. It's been really a long titanic struggle. We got to be there, and at that point, we were still giving them helmets and first aid kits, which are very useful, body armor and things like that. But when I was able to come back again in 17, we had moved on. Security assistance dollars funded by you all, the taxpayer, had increased, and during the time I was there, it was about $650 million when I first arrived total, since about, I don't know if that was all time or since 2014. When I left, it was $1.5 billion. And I think since I've left, the annual amounts of assistance going to Ukraine from us have increased even more. So that's a good story. While we were there, the Javelin missiles came. So that was a big deal. And I remember sending off this final document that has to go back to the States for these Javelins, and I had a guy from the Econ section help me. So I said, hey man, you know what this represents? I wanted to make sure you understood what we were actually sending back. And he did, really good guy. But we had the bilateral relationship, and there's NATO. And we're talking about NATO, and there's a NATO liaison office in Ukraine. In 2006, it was kind of small, a little bit sleepy, working hard, but there's one of the themes I would say I've observed is I think we were a little bit lethargic in some ways about working through the years. I'm not pinning it on any one organization, but certainly after 2014, I think things picked up. There's a lot of little programs they have with through the NATO liaison office. We had a PARP, program and review process, a lot of other things, little sub-programs. Never got the map, because when you get a map, you are going to be a member of NATO. But while I was there, right towards the end, the Ukrainians said, hey, NATO membership is so important to us, we are going to enshrine it in our constitution. So they did. So they were committed to it, and it's hard. It's hard work, and I can comment, at some point about what do you think? How long do you think it'll take? I think it'll take a while. It would take a while, which is another whole thing about trying to keep Ukraine out of NATO. I think you're making good progress, but if it happens, it's going to take a while. So, from my own personal experience, it was not an imminent event. So I don't want to give necessarily my own personal name. I don't want to give Putin that out. It's not like you're getting ready to bang a gavel and Ukraine would be in NATO tomorrow. There's a lot of work involved in that, and there are a lot of different organizations that we work with. We work with the Ukrainians in the West tactically at the Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine. We rotate a training unit in U.S. Initially active duty, then it was National Guard. Run a 9-month cycle, and then we bring in another National Guard unit. they're training basic tactics to make them, kind of move them more NATO interoperable. We had Ministry of Defense advisory team. And that was a great experience. I don't know which example I'd like to use more, 12 Angry Jurors or Herding Cats, but it was, working with those guys was a real experience. Because they're all doing different areas of reform. They're all kind of experts in their field. GS-15s, people who have experience, and they come over to Ukraine for a year or two, work with them in these different areas like personnel reform, logistics, NATO, and all of these different areas. And then on top of that, you had at the strategic level, the Defense Reform Advisory Board, which was headed by General Abizade, retired, ran that for a while. You all know him, and General retired three-star General Dayton took that over while I was there. So just a lot of effort was going in at multiple levels, and the ambassador was pushing really hard, pushing and cajoling and pulling and supporting the effort. So that's a quick overview of all the things that were going on when I was there. So the question, to kind of dovetail with Gordon's theme, and I think it's a really good one, is about NATO and to what extent is this about NATO and not allowing Russia to become a member of NATO. And I think that if you look back across history, they have a robust history of what I call spoiling the bride, if you will. So here's one of my cheap analogies, so bear with me. So Russia's like the guy who's burned by, he's chasing, he's a suitor, he's chasing the love of his life, and she's not receptive to him. So he throws acid on her, or he spoils her in such a way that she won't be palatable to the other person. And they've done that numerous times. Transnistria, related to Moldova, Georgia in 2008, Crimea 2014, and continuing on today. So it's a modus operandi, I guess, if you will. But what I would throw out is, I think that, and I've read this and thought this too, in some ways it could be all about NATO, but I think it's more that Putin fears color revolutions. And so 2004 in Ukraine, it's basically a mostly indigenous movement of the people to overthrow oppressive leadership. 2004 it happened in Ukraine, happened again in 2014. The Orange Revolution in 2004 happened in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, happened in Kyrgyzstan. And so Putin's watching this and he's like, oh man, I could be next. And so what he doesn't want, in my view, he doesn't want Ukraine to be successful, because a successful Ukraine on his doorstep is a threat to him. And he also saw what happened during the Arab Spring. And he saw how Gaddafi died. And that made it tough on him. He doesn't like that. So that's what he fears. He fears, in my opinion, he fears that successful democratic Ukraine on his doorstep. And he can't allow that to be, because then he's a failure. So I just throw that out there and wrap it up on that.
As you would have expected from the biographies, really evocative remarks from each of our panelists, I think, thoughtful, the kinds of things you're not hearing in the press. That's why we come to the Palmetto forums, to hear a little bit about this. I really want to take the opportunity to open up the floor. I have a couple of questions I could ask as well of the group, but I want to take the opportunity to take your questions. So I'll stand so I can see anyone for questions as we go. And as I'll filibuster for a second while I'm waiting for a hand and say, people have asked about the timing of this. There are a lot of thoughts around that, whether it had to do with the time of year, frozen tundra before things got muddy, other things. One thing no one has talked about, and you would note this out in 2014 in Crimea as well, it immediately followed the end of the Olympic Games. A very, very serious event for Russia, very important for patriotism. It followed right on the heels of it. We're announcing the closing ceremonies yesterday, and we're announcing this very same day. And when Russia was involved in a horrible cheating scandal in 2014 in Sochi, which really should have led to the banning of their athletes for a long period, the punishment of the international community was to change the name of the entity that was participating, and now it was the Russian Olympic Committee. This time, previous Olympics, it was a slightly different variation. But you will note, Putin was there for the opening ceremonies. The colors are the colors of the Russian flag. So in other words, these were sort of Pyrrhic steps that had no real impact in terms of demonstrating a real response that had consequences for, in that case, an athletic violation. But I don't think that's coincidental, the timing of that. Yes.
Although none of you claimed responsibility for the excellent timing of today's session and everything else, now that it's started, are objectives going to change, and what's your estimation of a timeline and duration? Do you have any feel for that?
I suspect everyone has thought. Can I start with you both?
I don't know, I'll take a swing at it. I would just say that he has the troops ready to go wherever he wants and do pretty much whatever he wants to do. But I will tell you also that Ukrainian forces now are not the ones they were in 2014. So I'm really interested. I hope it doesn't come to invasion. I really hope it doesn't come to that. But God forbid, if it does, it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of fight they put up, because I think it's going to be a lot different. I have always said, I think what Putin's been doing, it's his timeline. He'll get all his pieces in place, and then he'll figure it out. Like, do I want to go? Do I not want to go? And he's trying to see what he can break in the meantime. It's like building up pressure. Can he drive the Ukrainian president out without even invading? That would be better. So he's trying to read those things and how much he can damage with this sort of pressure before an actual invasion. He'll try and get as much done as he can before actually invading. So that may affect the time.
Yeah, listen, no special knowledge here on Putin's plans or whatever, but I think that there's definitely a sense that even in the Russian-speaking parts of Ukraine, that this is an unwelcome thing, and I think that might change the calculus a little bit. It makes it much more difficult and costly. They're not going to be, heralded as concrete heroes, put it that way. But who knows? He could go all in and take the whole country. He could take the eastern half. Who knows? Perhaps he just expands the Donetsk Republic a little bit. I don't know. Maybe he squeezes them, with different ways, like you said, to try to pressure the actor turned president in Ukraine. Who knows?
They say that prognostication about the future is so difficult because it relates to the future. So you never know what's going to happen. I'll offer an alternative scenario, possibly, of what if. What if we help to work in NATO to say maybe we shouldn't have laid out a timetable for Ukraine or Georgia to get into NATO, because that obviously was a tripwire that caused Russia to react the way they did. People have been looking at Finland as a possible example of a country that has remained neutral. I'm not saying that Finland and Ukraine are necessarily alike, or that Ukraine and Georgia not getting in NATO anytime soon, how that will play in those countries. But if the fear that has motivated Russia to take this drastic action was, we don't want to see these two countries join NATO and have long-range or medium-range missiles based there right on our border. Now, it could be that this is all sort of BS on their part. Some people think it's dissembling. But if Russia does go full force into the invasion mode, they're going to encounter a lot of pushback, not only with shutting down their economy and their banking system and all of those sorts of things, but also by the Ukrainian or the Georgian people themselves. You're going to have insurgencies that they're going to have to be putting down, and that will just give more resolve. And I repeat, there are a lot of European nations, Germany, France, Italy, the Benelux countries, that did not want us to proceed back in 2006, 2008 on trying to fast track these two nations into NATO. They said doing that is potentially inflammatory and dangerous, and we might want to proceed more cautiously. But the Bush administration was intent on, sort of taking 2 pawns off the table from the former Soviet Union, and so they were hell-bent to do it. And at least they could change the language that that says, or they could look at that language that says, are these countries really living up to the standard of peaceful resolution of conflicts, no external territorial disputes, no internal ethnic disputes? It's abundantly clear that neither country rises to those kinds of standards at the moment.
I just want to riff on part of the answer to your question that Steve gave. President Zelensky, and you've likely read about this, is a fascinating figure. He's an actor who played in a TV show about an actor who becomes the president. And then he became the president. And when that happened, Steve and I were in Kharkiv as that election was happening, as that was unfolding. And there was a lot of talk within the group, and these were sort of leading, actually there were members of the Supreme Court there, judges, prosecutors, about whether Zelensky was himself a puppet of Moscow. What was the angle here? No one quite, he kind of appeared late in the race. What is the story on this guy? And of course that certainly doesn't appear to be the case now, but it's interesting to watch the dynamics. Normally in this kind of situation, we have 2 sovereign nations. The negotiations would be between, the diplomatic efforts would be between the Ukrainian president and the Russian president. Who did Putin call shortly before his announcement last night? He called the president of France and the chancellor of Germany. It's telling you what the dynamics are, the power dynamics. And Putin, I think, again, is trying to play a game here to sort of shift the dynamics, the power dynamics within NATO. I think he's placing some pressures on NATO in those ways. And I think that's an interesting dynamic to look at. And then I also want to mention one other thing. My colleague from the College of Communications and Information, Tom Reichert, is here today. And he has a colleague, Randy Covington, who's been working with the Rule of Law Collaborative as we've attempted to get involved on the rule of law space in countering deep fakes. Deep fakes out of Russia, Iran, and China primarily. And Randy has extraordinary video. You'll have read about the Biden administration did an outstanding job of outing the risk that Russia was going to use deep fakes to sort of create truly fake news about there's been a massacre in X, and look at the video. When you watch the video, I've seen videos, Randy has shown me videos that they prepared, you would have no idea that there was anything fake about what's being done. The quality of the presentations, how it's done, is extraordinary, and they're able, now he's able to piece out this woman who's telling the story about her family massacre. Oh, by the way, she's also an actress on that show, or you can eventually piece together the pieces. But unless we're there telling the stories, that's going to be a component of this. And it's why the work that we do that's a little bit less glamorous on the day-to-day basis in sustaining and building the rule of law is so important, because it allows the precursors to tell stories in these moments of crisis, but also, as several panelists pointed out along the way, Steve's point about the average Russian, I think is exactly right. I think it's exactly right. I think I'd actually go further. I would say the average Russian would say that the breakup of the Soviet Union 30 years ago was a catastrophe for Russia and should never have been allowed to happen. And so this is a chance, again, it's a patriotic angle, and you add on top of that these deep fakes. You didn't even need it. Now you add those on top as an additional layer. Stories about things happening to Russian citizens in Ukraine, to Russian citizens in Kazakhstan, to Russian citizens in Moldova, and the list goes on now, which aren't true. But you didn't, as Steve says, the ground was fertile, but it actually is being built on. And that's why the work we do day to day is so important, and the partnerships we have. Yes, sir.
Yeah, back to Russia's fear of NATO. I'd like to hear a little bit more about why that is. I mean, NATO's never, in 70 years, have never invaded anybody, I don't believe, have they? I don't think they've invaded anybody. On the other hand, Finland, which might be interested in invading, might be interested in joining NATO, they have been invaded by Russia. Poland has been invaded by Russia. Several of these countries have had a problem. with Russia. So how legitimate, I mean, do you give any legitimacy to Putin's claims of being concerned about NATO? What's the concern?
Well, we start with the baseline that Ukraine used to be part of the Soviet Union, and as we've been hearing in the last few days from Putin, he doesn't even see it as an independent country. The Ukrainians are essentially the same as the Russians. They're all Slavic peoples and have a long history together. I think what really is motivating their concern, and I don't think that it's just PR or that they're just saying this. They have a legitimate fear that if NATO, that was created in large part to protect Western Europe from the Soviet Union, has new members in Georgia and Ukraine, then it becomes a staging ground for whatever sort of military action the West might want to take. Now, I'm not sure that they really believe that we are hell-bent to start marching into Ukraine or Georgia, into Russia from Ukraine or Georgia. But there is a real fear that we will be basing medium or even longer range missiles and weapon systems in those places that could target virtually all of European Russia. And so that is a legitimate fear. At least, maybe I'm too much of a Russian specialist to have adopted their viewpoint of things, but I think that, if Quebec went communist or, pro-Russian, and they were putting long-range missiles there that were going to target the United States, as unlikely as that is, that we would have some legitimate concerns about it. And so all I'm saying is that from the Russian perspective, they have legitimate concerns about NATO, and they've been making those clear, but we ignored all of those warnings that they had put out there for the last 18 years. We've been ignoring their warnings, not taking it seriously, and instead we tended, I think, to view the Cold War between the two countries as kind of like a chess match. And the United States felt like it had the opportunity to take two of the pawns away from the Russian side, namely Georgia and Ukraine, while we could, as targets of opportunity. Although, again, as I quoted, NATO wouldn't let them do it like that because they didn't meet the standards. And Russia has now proven that they manifestly don't meet the standards by occupying part of those countries, and those breakaway republics in both countries have declared themselves as autonomous breakaway republics and have even gotten diplomatic recognition by, Russia and Vanuatu, or, the 3 or 4 different countries in the world. But it has some legitimacy. And I think it was a mistake to sort of announce and to try to fast track those two countries, and I don't think we would be where we are now had we recognized the sensitivities Russia would have had for such a move.
I would just say, you're applying a logical approach to looking at the situation. And the average Russian is looking at it from an emotional standpoint, from a more of a nationalistic, tribal, emotional viewpoint, where there's a sense of loss and now we're just righting a wrong. I really think it can kind of be filtered down into that simple of a viewpoint. But that's how I see it, at least. I think it's emotion versus logic when you talk about why are they feeling threatened.
Yeah, as I think I touched on earlier, I'm a little bit less of the NATO fear. I do agree with Gordon. There was a push, and if you look, the announcement in 2008 for Georgia, and then what happens in August? You have the Olympics, so always remember beware of the Olympics. And he goes and spoils the bride. He goes and tries to prevent NATO membership, essentially, and show the strength of Russia. So he did it there. And then, same thing with Ukraine, right after Sochi in 2014. But I believe more that it's the fear of democracy. That's real, in my opinion, that's what he really fears. I think the NATO thing is the grievance. It's the grievance tool that he uses to rally his people. He can't say, I'm afraid of democracy, because then he's blown his cover. He's like, we gotta look at how NATO has abused us, and we had to take this action. So that's his rallying cry, but the real reason, in my opinion, is he fears that democracy, because there will be success. It might be a long time. He doesn't want to end up in a culvert like Gaddafi did. Now, I do think we've kind of been on autopilot for quite a while with NATO, and we could have done some things better. And you can make announcements, but like I've said, when you're really working toward NATO, there's a lot of work that goes into it. And sometimes, we might have seemed to want it more than they did. Because a lot of prevarication, a lot of sandbagging, sometimes from certain people, certain areas who are very kind of hidebound. They're kind of resistant to the Western approach in some ways. So it's something that's a long road. And so it's not something, and you gotta have unanimity in NATO to actually do that. NATO is a club, it's a very exclusive club. I do think we've reached a good level now. I don't think we need to really enlarge it too much more personally, but it's a club. And people want in because they know once they're in, they get that defensive protection, Article 5 protection. But big NATO is gonna be very selective about who they allow in.
There's nothing wrong with that, to be a member of that club.
No.
Absolutely.
It's a good thing to be a member of that club.
And I would just say, I see a question in the back, I would just add,
I want to emphasize that point. I agree. I think that this is the reason today for the action, but it would have happened anyway at some other time. And I think the other thing that none of us has mentioned that is on the table in terms of an actual tangible loss as part of the diplomatic process has to do with our weapons in Poland, because that's very much on the radar for Putin. And I think when you talk about when he starts negotiating and say, well, you want me to pull back? Then I need those weapons out of Poland. So I think that when you start looking about, which isn't in play for an invasion, but I think you start talking about what his end game is, what he's hoping to achieve, that's going to be high on the list of not even at the next level of things he's going to expect.
I've heard that the embassies have emptied, and many of the ambassadors and their families have gone to Poland to seek refuge, if you will. And the one that has not emptied is the Chinese embassy. And I wondered if that's true, or if it is true, what does that say?
I don't know if that's true, but having been the person who commented on China earlier, I will say, China is obviously a very strong ally of Russia. Actually, China has a diplomatic role to play here potentially, so there could be some value in Chinese diplomats staying in Ukraine to be part of a negotiated solution to the crisis as it escalates and as it evolves. But I don't know if others have any thoughts or comments.
I can't read your face as well as these two. I know these guys, but.
I just saw the news of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is decided to pull their diplomatic staff from Ukraine. I don't know what to say about China.
I just sent a WhatsApp this morning and checking on a guy that I knew who was heading over there, and he was part of staff. He said he's in Poland now. I think they're all out. This is a tough one. I personally, I'm a little more thinking I wish we stayed, because I'd be like, and now it's easy for me to say I'm sitting here, but and I'm sure there's some reasons that I'm not privy to. But when you vacate the embassy, I'm tempted to say, hey, we're staying here, and you got Russia, and you're not going to do anything to us. I guess you might, depending on what they do, you might have to leave eventually. But it's the optics. There's a big optic there. It's not an end all be all, but it's just one optic among maybe a whole bunch. I don't know anything about Chinese embassy.
Joel, do we have time for another question?
Yeah, I have time for maybe the last two right here up front. So we did.
is there anything you actually been doing, in theory, something that years from now we would say, we should have done this? What could we be doing unilaterally? Just the U.S. What could we be doing? Remember, we got other people out there looking at us Chinese. Here comes Taiwan, right? So what could we be doing?
And this will be a vague response, but I think that we need to spend a lot more time and attention getting inside the heads of who our opponents are and what their fears are, where their triggers are, what is going to push them over the edge to go in a way we don't want them to go. Or the reverse of that, what can we do to lower the level of threat? What can we do to mollify? I'm not talking about Finlandization necessarily, but I think that lowering the temperature of things, and I guess getting back to the major point I was wanting to make here, was that announcing to God and everybody that we intend to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO as soon as possible. If you talk to people in NATO, they'll go, oh, no. It's probably 20 or 30 or maybe 50, who knows how many years before they're going to be in. Well, then why the hell are we talking about it? Why are we raising that as a scenario that's just going to provoke Mr. Putin and become an excuse for what maybe he would like to do anyway? So it's a couple of points.
Take one last question. What role, if any, is there for the United Nations in this situation?
I'm glad Gordon just said, oh boy. For the first 15 years of my career here, I taught international law classes at the law school. And I had a dear colleague who taught jurisprudence, now retired, Pat Hubbard, somebody you may know around town. Pat would invite me to his jurisprudence class, which I called the beat up on Joel Samuels and his discipline class. But the point of that class, the session that he had, was how international law is not real law. And the two primary bases for the attack on international law had to do with the fact that international law is made, I'm not going to go on my big diatribe, but international law is made differently than traditional law. It's a whole different conversation for another day, and it's true. Other than treaties, international law is often made through actions or inactions and why we do or don't do certain things, which is not, no other law can be made that way. But the real issue that they went to was the lack of enforcement mechanisms in international law. And the fact that international law is violated all the time, so it can't be real law. And my immediate response to that is, why then does no one question criminal law? We have a body of law, local, state, national, federal, criminal law, and people violate it every day. People are violating it here in Columbia as we speak, and no one says, well, criminal law, that's not real law. Speak limits. But the point is, the United Nations has become, I fear, the sort of siren call of the ineffectiveness of the international law system. And I think the Security Council, because Russia has a veto on the Security Council, that tells us the Security Council, which does have the power to intervene when there's an aggressive military action, will not invoke its powers under Chapter 7, will not take action. And what it will be is just a forum for discussion, but it will not actually be able to do anything meaningful. I think it's a shame. I think if we go back to the purposes in 1945 of the creation of not only the UN, but the Bretton Woods agencies in general, it's really sad to see that we're in a situation now where the structure that we have means realistically, I would be surprised if anyone on this panel thought the UN was going to be a meaningful player in the resolution of this. Yeah, I don't think it is. We know we've exceeded our time. I'm sure that the panelists will be happy to stay on to chat one-on-one. I'm going to use the privilege of being here. I was the last minute stand-in moderator to share with you not to steal more of your day, but as engaged members of our community, that we have an extraordinary speaker coming to our campus tonight at 6 o'clock in Booker T. Washington Auditorium. Imani Perry, who is a chair professor at Princeton University of African American Studies, will be speaking to us about her most recent book, which has just come out. And I'm going to just read you a little bit about it. The name of the book is South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon Line to Understand the Soul of the Nation. And her talk tonight will talk about what she's done in the book, which is weaving together stories of immigrant communities, contemporary artists, exploitative opportunists, enslaved peoples, unsung heroes, her own ancestors, and her lived experiences. Imani Perry crafts a tapestry unlike any other. This is obviously from the book announcement and the book tour, but she'll be speaking at Booker T. Washington. I would encourage you to come. I'm happy to talk afterwards about that. I think it'll be an extraordinary opportunity for us to talk about something that is really important to us, which is the importance of the south of the Mason-Dixon line. I grew up in Washington, D.C., so I was right there on the line. But to the history of our entire country, she's a leading thinker, and it's really exciting to have her on campus. So I hope many of you will be able to attend that. One last time, I want to thank Dickson Monk for his partnership. I want to thank Jody Salter and Josh Grace for their efforts, and I want to ask you to please join me in thanking our panelists today.